Welcome back to Ryan and Brian's Bible Bistro. I'm Ryan.
Hey, and I'm Brian.
And this is the
Bible Bistro,
a podcast. All about, don't stop. A podcast all about the Bible, theology, and all things related to the Christian faith.
I'm just going to warn our listeners and viewers right now that Ryan has already shared with me that he's been working on several projects and he has had a large amount of caffeine today.
I am fully caffeinated. I'm as leaded as you can get.
He's just going to kind of take this, and I'm gonna roll with it. And
no, it's good. It's good. You know, for 3:15, it's good. It's good. Yeah, I'm good. Everything's fine. My heart's fine. It's like 3:15 p.m. and I have never felt more alive than I do right now.
On a Friday.
I have never felt more alive. But anyway, we're back. You
could probably binge a whole TV show tonight.
Yes.
Anyway,
we're back. We're back to Daniel. Now, this is back. We're Daniel 6. I'm trying to slow down my speech. I'm sorry.
You're fine. I already gave a warning. We'll flash some kind of thing, you know.
Highly caffeinated.
Like flashing over your head.
Yeah, I may pass out. So Daniel 6 here. Daniel 6, we're wrapping up the narrative part of Daniel.
Yes, this will be the last one till we get to chapter 7. Although there was
yes,
what?
6, then 7.
Well,
correct.
7. Daniel 7. I guess when I say Daniel 7, that means something to me. But that begins our very strongly apocalyptic visions that Daniel has, and so 7 through 12 really have a different character. Although, you know, we may point this out at the end of this episode. You've got this by one of our former guests, a writing he did on Daniel, and you know, he I think it's a really good point that he shows the connections between chapter 7 and really the chapters 2 through 6 particularly. But maybe we'll say about that later. I've said that I think there's a close connection between chapter 7 and chapter 2. Mm-hmm. The 4 kingdoms that are talked about in 2, I think, are the same 4 that are talked about in 7. Although again, some people disagree. So you might remember it's been a while for us. I guess it was only last week for everybody else. But Daniel 5 ended with Darius the Mede taking control. You remember the whole story of Belshazzar and the writing on the wall and that very night, and really interesting kind of story that we have there. Daniel 6 then begins with Darius. The way I'll put it is kind of organizing his kingdom, beginning to put into order the things that he had taken from the Babylonians. And so he begins to organize them by provinces. We find that he appoints satraps is the word that's used often here.
Satraps?
Satraps, yeah, that's just governors.
Not satraps?
I don't know. I don't speak ancient Aramaic. I don't know. Satrap. It could be. Ancient Persian. It probably is Persian. Even.
I just thought, I just always heard it as satrap. I'm sorry.
Okay, that's satrap. So I'm from Southern Indiana, so we really kind of just talk however we want.
I know. You said that many times.
Chapter 531, and so go ahead and read 531 since we left that off last week. Go ahead and read 531.
Yeah. And Darius the Mede took over the kingdom at the age of 62.
So I was just mentioning to you before this started that there are some times, and you'd ask about this question because you read some commentaries that talk about this and there and Darius the Mede. So there are some older translations of Daniel. We're talking about back in the Aramaic that begin this narrative section with that verse. So we have, you know, in English, we've tacked that verse 31 onto the end of 5. So he takes over from Belshazzar that very night, Darius the Mede, and then this. But there are those who begin chapter 6, what we would call chapter 6, this narrative about Daniel the lion's den begins with this idea and Darius the Mede. There is a connection here, obviously. And I'll let you point this out a little bit later, but there's some thematic connections here as well.
Yeah.
So there's some relationship here. Very soon after Darius the Mede takes the empire, he begins to put things in order. Verses 1 through 3 are similar to what we've seen earlier. And I'll go ahead. The other connection, I mentioned chapter 2 and chapter 7. The other connection we see is a strong one between this one and chapter 3. you'll remember the story of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, and it's a very similar story, really, right? There's jealousy. There's a kind of a trap that's laid for them, and it ends up that they are put into danger, and God delivers them. It's a very similar kind of story, and even some of the details are very similar. But this, of course, it's the difference is it involves a new group of people. It's the Medes now, and it's kind of the setting of Darius beginning to organize his empire is kind of the setting for this too, because he places Daniel in a very high position, and this causes a great deal of jealousy in among the ranks. So go ahead and read the first 3 verses then of chapter 6 of as we have it, of Daniel chapter 6.
It pleased Darius to appoint 100 satraps to rule throughout the kingdom, with 3 administrators over them. One of them was Daniel. The satraps were made accountable to them so that the king might not suffer loss. Now Daniel so distinguished himself among the administrators and the satraps by his exceptional qualities that the king planned to set him over the whole kingdom.
So he was going to be elevated even to be kind of the supervisor for this entire system, kind of a 2-tiered system that we have where, probably over regions there are various satraps, maybe even, multiple ones for each region, because some people have questioned the number 120. Seems like a lot. But then there are 3 governors over them that kind of rule. And the idea is Daniel excelled in this, just like we've seen other times. And the other one, I'll go ahead and mention the other thing. I've said this before. The other character in the Old Testament this reminds me of is Joseph. You remember when Joseph was down in Egypt, and everything he did, no matter what kind of situation he found himself in, he was continued to be elevated. Look back. You've got your Bible there, don't you?
Yeah.
Look back in verses 11, chapter 5, 11, and 12. Go ahead and read this. This talks about kind of Daniel's superiority, if you will. Daniel's.
There is a man in your kingdom who has the spirit of the holy gods in him. In the time of your father, he was found to have insight and intelligence and wisdom like that of the gods. Your father, King Nebuchadnezzar, appointed him chief of the magicians, enchanters, astrologers, and diviners.
Okay, go ahead.
He did this because Daniel, whom the king called Belteshazzar, was found to have a keen mind and knowledge and understanding, and also the ability to interpret dreams, explain riddles, and solve difficult problems.
So he's excelling above the others in this. And what I wanted to particularly point out was actually the very first thing you read, where it talks about that this was attributed to the idea that the spirit of the gods, or spirit of God, is in him. And if you'll remember, this is something that Daniel has insisted on the whole time. And I think that's another really interesting part of this whole story, is he continues to say, there's nothing exceptional about me. But, as I've said repeatedly, there is a God in heaven, right?
Yes.
And he has enabled me, right, by his spirit, Daniel says. He has enabled me to do these things. So it's really an interesting contrast to the pride, as we talked about last week, of the kings like Belshazzar, who is basically showing his own ego. Here is Daniel instead saying, this has nothing to do with me. This is only a gift of God that allows me to do these things. And I think it's a good part of his character that we see.
I just don't know why you have the rest of them. We just talked about the enchanters and the sorcerers and all that stuff. And you got Daniel, oh, call this guy. I think his name's Daniel. No, what's he done so far?
Well, there are probably other stories that we don't hear about.
I'm sure.
One day the king has a bunion, and he says he calls all the enchanters, and the enchanter says, "Oh, you may want to put some acid on that or something." It takes care of it.
Yeah.
And they don't have to call Daniel in. Or there's this the diviner says there's this magic mushroom that the gods have shown.
Oh, all right, fine.
Those are the stories.
We don't get those. It's always oh wait, can we dig in the closet and find this one guy that was here? Holy cow.
Right.
Remember those 3 guys who were in the furnace? No, I don't remember that. I don't remember these stories. Who are we talking about? Anyway, that's my shaded response.
And again, well, you do bring up an interesting point. I'm always talking about the narrative, and that's every narrative shows selection, right?
Yeah.
I'll mention it now. If you remember in the very first week we talked about Daniel, I mentioned then that if we take these accounts and we take historical Daniel, which I do, then by this time, if we put all the kings in order, He's in his 80s now,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
And if you think about it, from the time he's probably a young man, maybe late
15.
teens,
Yeah.
15 to 20 in that range, and now he's in his 80s. Over a period of 60 years, these are just a few stories, right?
Right. Yeah.
And so there's lots of other stuff that happened, but these have been selected and they've also been arranged. I always say narrative always has selection arrangement, unless it's your Uncle Benny telling you the story, and then it has neither.
No inspiration. Yeah. Just whatever comes in his head.
He neither selects nor arranges. It's just kind of stream of consciousness. But when you're telling a story, you need to pick and choose what plot points you're going to talk about, and you arrange them in a way in order to, I don't know, in order to be convincing, or sometimes you do it in order to have an element of surprise, or there's different ways you can arrange the same story. You could tell the same story in different ways that's going to have a different intended effect. And I think, again, we've talked about the Holy Spirit's role in all this. I think the Holy Spirit, what he intends, if you will, to do in us, also may have something to do with the arrangement. Anyway, that's just side there. But verses 4 and 5, let me go ahead and read that. It says, at this, the administrators, satraps could find no basis for charges against Daniel and his conduct of government affairs, but they tried to, but they were unable to do so. They could find no corruption in him because he was trustworthy and neither corrupt nor negligent. Finally, these men says, we will never find any basis for charges against this man Daniel unless it has something to do with the law of his God. So he's showing himself to be faithful both in his issues of life and faith, but also in his duties. And we're not kind of really given this, but the idea is that they become jealous of his being elevated to this status. Whether it's because he's an quote unquote outsider, whether it has something to do with just their desire to be in that position, whatever. We don't really get that detail, but whatever it is, they begin to attack him. And I find it really interesting that it says the only thing that we can find against him would have to do with the law of his God. It goes back to chapter 1. You might remember that, where eat the food the king puts in front of you from the king's table. And they're like, oh, we can't do that.
Appreciate it, but no.
So there's no basis for a charge, especially then if you're reading this as a one of God's people, you're saying, well, even in his uprightness with the law, there's nothing to condemn. But that's the beginning of this plot against him, and we find other stories like this, not only in the Bible, but also in the ancient Near East in general. But then also we find the same kind of thing in here's the other thing this reminds me of, is the times that Jesus faces traps. They try to trap him a couple of different times. One that comes to mind is when they ask him about taxes. And it's you don't necessarily see it immediately, but it's the fact that it is the Herodians and the Pharisees who come to ask him that question together, which is a very strange combination,
right?
And makes you pick up your ears and you go, oh, wait a minute, they're trying to trap him in this. And there's another time in John I won't mention right now, but because there's a lot, there's just too much going on there.
Yeah.
But there are times where Jesus is put in the same kind of position where, they put him in a position where they think that he's going to answer in a particular way that is going to be against his own character, if you will, his own law. And he doesn't do that. And it's the same here, that Daniel is they think, well, we can trap him by making him go against the law of his God. So this is verses 6 and 7. So these administrators and satraps, satraps, is that how you say it?
Yes, I know Aramaic. Thank you for.
I have to look it up. I honestly don't know. Went as a group to the king and said, may King Darius live forever. I say Darius sometimes and Darius too, so I don't know. The royal administrators, prefects, whatever's, advisors, and governors have all agreed that the king should issue an edict and enforce the decree that anyone who prays to any god or human being during the next 30 days. Now, let's come back and think about that idea. Praise to any god or human being during the next 30 days, except to you, your majesty, shall be thrown into the lion's den. Now, your majesty, issue the decree and put it in writing so that it cannot be altered in accordance with the law of the Medes and Persians, which cannot be repealed. So King Darius put the decree in writing. So several interesting things here going on. One is, for the Persians, this idea that the kings have a godly, a divine role is not unheard of. So this isn't like a weird, seems to us kind of a weird thing. We wouldn't necessarily bow our knee. But the other thing is I'm saying to like a governor or ruler or something like that necessarily. But the,
oh my gosh.
The idea of
moving on,
the idea of praying here is kind of the idea of making a petition, right? When we're praying in particular, now there's different parts of praying, but I think we're particularly thinking here about petitioning God for something, desiring something, asking something of God. Those whatever you want to call those petitionary prayers is kind of the term that I would use in this. And so if you think about it, it's the same kind of thing with a ruler, right? There are times you go to a ruler and petition them for whatever the needs. Oh Lord, would you grant me whatever it is. And so they're saying basically, I think, not necessarily pray to him in that sense, but basically, may we only come to you to ask for our needs, right? And put you in that kind of position, that kind of role of being our provider.
So,
right?
so you don't see this as being like a polytheistic, because the Egyptians.
No, it's
kind of
it's definitely polytheistic.
Or that he has divinity to them, but it's just like, I don't need to pray to them like in how we would say we pray. I can go to him directly because he's embodied,
petition him. Yeah,
embodied divinity.
And I think it would have to do with this. Again, it seems kind of strange, but for me, it helps me a little bit. You see what I'm saying? That you go to a governor and ask for something.
Right.
And so think about this, particularly if you are just in the beginning of your rule, right? If you've just taken over this empire, it would behoove you to say anything that anybody wants, let them come to me and ask, right? In other words, it's kind of a way to consolidate that power. You are the provider. It's similar. It's not exactly the same, but it's similar later when the Caesars, and again, there's divine status attributed there, right? But the Caesars are seen as kind of the ones who are the givers of peace, right? And they're the givers of everything that's necessary for life, right? So it's that kind of an idea, and so I guess the only reason I'm saying this is it helps me to think, because it's just otherwise it's kind of an odd thing, and especially how quickly Darius goes, oh yeah, okay. In a similar way, remember we saw Nebuchadnezzar, and that was kind of early in his reign too. Remember, where he puts up the statue and says, "Let everyone bow to me," right, and essentially recognize. I think I used the term allegiance. Then make everybody give allegiance to me. And so here I would see it more as so we owe allegiance only to God, but God's people also recognize that every good thing we have doesn't come from the ruler; it ultimately comes from God, and He is the one.
Yeah. So do we see this kind of concept? Is it when Jesus feeds the 5,000? It calls it the Sea of Tiberias, and as He gives them the bread and the fish and the loaves, and they say, "We want to make you king," because
chapter 6 of Gospel of John. That's. So that's the feeding of the 5,000, and John is the only one who uses that term Tiberius, and we have that connection with making you king.
Because after Jesus feeds them, then they're like, oh, we want to make you king over us
by force.
Yeah. So is that the same kind of idea, like that the Caesar was kind of like the giver of things, and we kind of have this in the Old Testament ideals as well, as like come to the king. The king's the one that gives you the provider,
that gives you the things that you need,
want.
Right? And again, it's I don't even think it's just only an ancient, idea. Don't worry too much. I'm even thinking about in medieval England, the idea of the feudal system,
right?
You have the lord and they are the ones, but even let's go into, let's say a political situation. What do we always talk about? We always talk about politicians make promises, right?
Right. Yeah.
Or what was I can't remember now. I know one of our good friends would know this immediately. Which president was it? Was like a chicken in every pot was kind of the, that everybody's going to have everything that they need.
Right.
And so, that's, everything from there to it's the economy stupid, I suppose we could say. And that's as far as I'll go. But the, it's still that way, right?
Mm-hmm.
There's a sense in which those who are in charge want us to see them as the one that we go to when we have needs. And there are people that way. Even I'm going to say even in the churches, right?
Mm-hmm.
It's sometimes our tendency to think, let's go look for what we need from the human leaders rather than the ones to whom the human leader is pointing. And that's one of the things as leaders, we have to continually resist that idea that we are the ones who are providing things for people, because we like that feeling, right?
Right.
It's a nice feeling,
Mm-hmm.
but ultimately it's same as Daniel. Then, no, it's not me. There's a God in heaven who's able to interpret dreams, I think is the correct standpoint. Okay. That's probably more than you wanted.
Well, I started the whole train going down a different path, but no, I think that's good that we kind of see what the idea is behind here.
Right. Now, the other thing I was going to mention with this idea of petition, though, is and this is unanswerable, but I'm going to tell you why I think in this way, is it makes you wonder what Daniel would be petitioning God for. Now, he's in his 80s, right? But he's a good Jewish follower of Yahweh, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so in terms of the covenant, in terms of what God has promised his people, what would be a good prayer of exile?
A Messiah.
And return
a deliverer.
Us. Yeah, return us to the homeland and rebuild the temple. And in fact, I'm going to show you just a little bit of just an image of that, I think. And so here's why I mention that, is because I think that fits in well with the apocalyptic that comes next. Because, right, apocalyptic is always about when we're not in control, when God's people are not in the political power.
Right.
It's about when God's people are oppressed. It's about when God's people, things are not the way that God's people want them to be, right, and not the way God has promised that they would be. And so they're looking for answers about when are these things going to happen. Habakkuk's cry, how long, O Lord, are you going to allow these things to happen? Or, the same cry of the slain saints under the altar in
Revelation.
And the fifth seal's opened. How long, O Lord, faithful and true, until you avenge our blood? And so that's kind of the continual question. And so I'm not trying to make too much out of this, but look, let me look just a little bit further, and I'll kind of show you why I'm thinking this. So they said, down in verse 9, he puts the decree in writing. And I should mention this. There's a passage in Esther, Esther 1:19 and also in 8:8. It talks about the same idea that the law of the Medes and Persians is irrevocable. Once the king of the Medes and Persians has, it's thus saith the king, once it's been put in writing, then it can't be revoked.
That's so interesting. When I was reading this, that's so interesting. Like you think about the king's the one that makes the calls always, but it's like this act of writing, like now he has to answer to a higher law that even the kings submit to.
And of course, that's very important for the plot, because later when we find Daniel caught in it, he can't even act himself. He is powerless to act himself in order to rescue Daniel, right? Mm-hmm. And so he has to look to God to be the one who rescues him, ironically.
Yeah.
But I think that's why it's important for the plot. But it's interesting. We see the same thing in the book of Esther, set in a similar context, where we have this same kind of thing. The law of the Medes and Persians, and I'll give you the reference again. It's Esther 1:19 and 8:8 mentions that. So it says in verse 10, now when Daniel learned that the decree had been published, he went home to his upstairs room where the windows opened toward Jerusalem. Okay, so there's part of our idea. This is his habitual place to pray, is in the windows that face toward Jerusalem. 3 times a day, he got down on his knees and prayed, giving thanks to his God, just as he had done before. I think that's an important part of this.
They knew they knew, just as he'd done before, they knew what he did.
He was going to do it. And Daniel doesn't change his routine. You know, this is not, you know, okay, we're going to outlaw prayer. So Daniel's like, well, I'm going to go open my windows and pray. Right. You get what I'm saying? Yeah. It's not like he's trying to thumb his nose at it. He's simply saying, this is my commitment. This is my devotion to God. It is to do this on a daily basis. This is a part of my faith. Right. Mm-hmm. And so I find that interesting, you know, and I think that's important. That's an important point to bring up, just as he had done before. And even the way that the verbs are given here is that this is his habitual. This is something that he does on a regular basis. And then notice this. So it says giving thanks here, but then verse 11 says, then these men went as a group and found Daniel praying and asking God for help. And that's the other thing I think is just this indication that this is a petition, right? This is, he's not asking the king for help, right? He's asking God for help. And that's a little bit of that flavor of apocalyptic that I'm talking about. Apocalyptic is basically saying that despite the way things appear, there is a God in heaven, and he is able to rescue his people, despite what it appears.
Yeah.
Thoughts on that? Any comments or questions on any of that?
I think about this. Thinking about his routine, like, was it just a visual routine? I think about Daniel has excelled in everything at this point, and obviously he's very theistic, God-oriented in all he does. Sure. I wonder how much of this is his conversation on to these other administrators he's with, or the satraps and stuff.
That's interesting. It's an interesting point.
Well, it's just, I think in a polytheistic society, would you not see people praying on a regular basis all over the place, potentially, or worship? They might worship in different ways, and not just be prayer. But I also think it's, asking, is he praying out loud? I'm just thinking about the pieces of the story. Like, how do they know he's asking God for help? Is he praying out loud to God for help? Or, and even in that, like, he's not being silent about his calling on God for assistance or praying to God.
Although I'm going to make a point here about that silence in just a minute, but
great.
No. I get your point. I'm going to say a couple things. First is, I've already alluded to the fact that I think Daniel had an influence later on. It's interesting to me that the opening of the story of the New Testament in Matthew, you have these magi, these wise men from the east who come and say, we've heard about this king that's going to be born of the Jews, right? And I think, I'm not saying they're the direct descendants of Daniel, but it's that kind of influence that God's people had in exile that would have taught these Eastern wise men those stories, right?
Right.
And the scriptures that would have said there's a star going to arise, this kind of thing, and that they knew to go to Jerusalem, all these kind of things. But the other thing I want you to see is, I think his whole life we still see, and Daniel knew the stories too, right? He knew that they were getting toward the period of time where God had promised in Jeremiah that I'm going to bring my people back after 70 years. I'm going to bring them back to the land. And, I think he knew that. I don't think there would have been any question. And so I think he has an anticipation. The same we see, like you said, for the Messiah coming. I think his is to return to Jerusalem. So I think that's why his practice is to open the windows toward Jerusalem and pray in that direction. And I think the asking God for help, you could see it as a rescue from the lions, I suppose, but I really see it as God come to the rescue of your people and do as you promised, is what I would imagine. Again, like I said, there's no way to know, but that's my imagination. Any other thoughts on that?
I have no more thoughts. I've been
flushed. So much coffee.
I've been flushed of thoughts.
Verse 12 says, so when they went to the king and spoke to him about his royal decree, did you not publish a decree that during the next 30 days, anyone who prays to any god or human being except you, your majesty, would be thrown into the lion's den? The king answered, the decree stands in accordance with the law of the Medes and Persians, which cannot be repealed. So here that is repeated. I should mention the lion's den. I was going to say something about that earlier. Why do you keep a bunch of lions around?
Well,
what were you going to say?
For a moment like this, I would throw in, if I were king, like, aren't you the one who published a decree? Like, someone that's coming in with that kind of attitude, like, yeah, you're the ones that brought it up. Get in that lion's den. That's why I had the lion's den. Just smart mouths. Yeah. Aren't you the one who wrote that? Anyway, that's
probably,
what I think.
Probably entertainment. They would have lions for that reason and that kind of thing. Anyway.
Yes, lion's den is, I would say, even if I'm king, it seems like a weird thing just to keep around for.
just to keep.
Just to have it around. Hey, you been to the lion's den recently? No, it's a pit with lions. Why would I go?
Then they said to the king, Daniel, who is one of the exiles from Judah. Now, that's why I mentioned earlier, is it because of his being an outsider? I find it funny that he's still called an exile from Judah if he is in his 80s now. That was all those years ago. One of the exiles from Judah pays no attention to you, your majesty, or to the decree you put in writing. He still prays 3 times a day. Even they, have this idea that he continues to do this. When the king heard this, he was greatly distressed. He was determined to rescue Daniel and made every effort until sundown to save him. But this is where that whole idea of the law of the Medes and Persians cannot be repealed comes in. And it's interesting, even with that, he tries every way that he can to find a relief. We don't have details of this. Is it a matter of, he goes to Daniel and says, hey, lie about who you're praying to or something like that. I don't know. But you get what I'm saying is he tries to save Daniel, but he finds that he's unable to in all of this. Then the men went as a group to King Darius and said to him, remember, your majesty, that according to the law of the Medes and Persians, no decree or edict from the king that the king issues can be changed. So the king gave the order, and they brought Daniel and threw him into the lion's den. So this is kind of the first half of the narrative up to this point, is kind of where we are. And, it again, it's one of those kind of things. When you think in terms of apocalyptic, you can think about this as a bigger kind of sense. Like, this is kind of an image of God's people, right, going into exile, and having these things happen to them, and so forth. But then the king said to Daniel, "May your God, whom you serve continually, rescue you." What he couldn't do in terms of rescuing, trying to secure rescue for him. May your God do that, is his petition, so to speak. Mm-hmm. So a stone was brought in, placed over the mouth of the den, and the king sealed it with his own signet ring, with the rings of the nobles, so that Daniel's situation might not be changed. And this is just kind of one of those things to heighten the ability. He didn't sneak out. There weren't other people who came in the night and let him out. The idea of the signet ring is to say, to indicate this is the king's own seal. It reminds us, of course, of the tomb, right? It reminds us of the seal that was placed there,
right?
In order, in order to ensure that no one was going to come and steal the body. Verse 18: Then the king returned to his palace and spent the night without eating and without any entertainment being brought to him, and he could not sleep. So, gives us an indication of his state of mind,
inner turmoil.
Yeah, exactly. In relation to all of that. Let me see. Was there anything? I'm trying to make sure I didn't miss that. Oh, I did forget this. So Darius' statement. Go back. You have Daniel 3:15. Go ahead and back and read that if you can get to it.
Yeah, Daniel 3:15.
This is the
Daniel 3:15. Now, when you hear the sound of the horn, flute, zither, lyre, harp, pipe, and all kinds of music, if you're ready to fall down and worship the image I made, very good. But if you do not worship it, you'll be thrown immediately into a blazing furnace. Then what God will be able to rescue you from my hand?
What God can rescue you. And now here's, may the God whom you serve rescue you. So that's, I'm just going to mention the verbal parallels there is all I was going to was going to point out.
Mm.
Okay, so here's then the kind of the denouement, so to speak. So verse 19 says, at the first light of dawn, so again, you're imagining him kind of waiting on the clock, waiting for the first light to come. King got up and hurried to the lion's den. When he came near to the den, he called to Daniel in an anguished voice, Daniel, servant of the living God, has your God, whom you serve continually, been able to rescue you from the lion's den? Verse 21, Daniel answered, may the king live forever. My God sent his angel, and he shut the mouths of the lions. They have not hurt me, because I was found innocent in his sight, nor have I ever done any wrong before you, your majesty. Now, here's the interesting thing about that. Do you notice that that's the very first words of Daniel in this entire story?
I do now. I have noticed now.
And in fact, it's interesting because that's the only words of him in this entire story. The only thing Daniel says in this. So, for this to be a story about Daniel, he's really kind of a passive participant in this, right?
It's just happening to him.
Things are done to him, and so this is his statement here, and I think it's kind of central. It's kind of central in this whole thing. Is basically, I'm innocent. My God has sent an angel, shut the mouths of the lions. In other words, he's acted to rescue me. He's acted on my behalf, and and I've not done any wrong either to you, or either to him or to you. King was overjoyed. So we see the change. He goes from an anguished voice now to an overjoyed voice after he finds Daniel safe. Gave orders to lift Daniel out of the den, and when Daniel was lifted from the den, no wound was found on him because he trusted in his God. So this is very similar to the fiery furnace. You might remember when they took them out, no smell of smoke even on them, no smell of smoke on their clothing. Mm-hmm. It emphasizes the miraculous nature of the healing. Similar things in the New Testament when Jesus heals, right? You have the paralytic stands up and leaps and praises God. I guess that's in the book of Acts. That's where I was thinking about there. But you have these complete cures, right? You have these that they're absolutely complete in their rescue, in their healing. And so the miracle here is complete. No wound at all was found on him because he had trusted in his God. So then, of course, the reversal is always a good one. Verse 24, at the king's command, the men who had falsely accused Daniel were brought in and thrown in the lion's den along with their wives and children. And before they reached the floor of the den, the lions overpowered them and crushed all their bones.
I don't remember that from the flannel graph. I'll be honest.
So it's an emphatic, right? It's an emphatic. The opposite of no wound on him, right, is that even before they hit the ground, the lions had crushed their bones.
Well, and answer this, like it says the men who had falsely accused Daniel, like,
yeah, was
it a false accusation?
I guess not. But it was I would call it a trap. Mm-hmm. I would call it a trap.
I mean, is this kind of parallel to Esther again? Like there's like a trap in Esther as well, and so like
similar.
This kind of idea that it wasn't necessarily about the false accusation, but it was that they were trying to set a trap just to get Daniel.
Yeah,
like the king's the king's looking back, kind of going, "Oh, you guys brought the 30-day thing to me. You made me sign it, and now you made me do this, and now I'm like, I've got easy." And
I think it's similar to the story of the woman taken in adultery. So, yeah.
You mean Susanna?
It's also similar to Susanna. There's a trap there for a righteous, in that case, Jewish woman to fall into. Mm-hmm. So, yeah, it's so what is this? And all these are wisdom stories, right? What they're teaching is basically, even when people are trying to trap us, even in our faithfulness, we don't respond by, giving up our practices. Instead, what does it say here? Daniel trusted in God to rescue him. So it's the same. So how do you respond to exile? How do you respond as a good Jewish person, a good person of God when you're in exile? Well, you don't give up on him. You don't you continue to be faithful in the things that he has called you to do, and you trust in his ability to rescue you despite every circumstance. I mean, it's a freaking lion, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
This isn't, he didn't throw him into the rabbit's den, right? It's not the
right. it's not a bowl full of kittens.
Right. Throw him into the kitten den.
Oh yeah, he's gonna be pounced on all night. Oh.
So you get what I'm saying, though, is so this idea of lion, I mean, it is, bring
Predator.
your worst.
Yeah.
Right. Bring your worst. A furnace so hot that the people who are stoking the furnace die from, the heat. Do your worst. And God still is able to protect his people in times of difficulty. That's the message. And I think, again, that's really the message of apocalyptic as well. We're going to see in chapter 7 through 12. So we want to keep a hold of that this idea that God will come and rescue his people. He'll rescue his people from exile, right? Mm-hmm. No matter what kingdom should arise, even if it looks like an iron monster with big teeth, even if it's an
dragon.
empire that looks like a lion, right? God is able to rescue us from them as well. So,
wow.
Thoughts on that? Any other comments or questions?
No. We'll finish it up, and I do have a question or a comment.
Go ahead and read. I just lost my Bible. My phone ran out of battery. So read verses 25 through 28 for me, and then I'm going to have you look over to Hebrews 11 too at some point.
Then King Darius wrote to all the nations and peoples of every language and all the earth, "May you prosper greatly. I issue a decree that in every part of my kingdom people must fear and reverence the God of Daniel. For he is the living God, and he endures forever. His kingdom will not be destroyed. His dominion will never end. He rescues and he saves. He performs signs and wonders in the heavens and on earth. He has rescued Daniel from the power of the lions." So Daniel prospered during the reign of Darius and the reign of Cyrus the Persian.
And it's very similar to then chapter 4, you might remember, with that decree that Nebuchadnezzar, remember that letter that he sent out into all the world. So this kind of decree. Of course, the decree of Darius allowing Cyrus, his co-regent, we understand, that's how we understand this, but Cyrus sending his decree that everyone should be returned to their homeland. Of course, then it's the beginning of the return from exile that we find. This idea of returning from exile to go to
rebuild the temple and rebuild Jerusalem.
Go back to Jerusalem, right?
Well, not rebuild the wall. But anyway.
Right. Eventually,
yes.
That's Nehemiah. So, but anyway, that's kind of the parallel we have here. Cyrus sends out this decree saying basically this is the God you should worship. So,
yeah, and this the reason you and I had talked about the "and" beforehand, connecting 5 and chapter 6 together was is this contrast of how the king of Babylon responded to God's revelation and God's the holy objects from the temple, and then we have Darius's response when he's confronted with these things. We have turning away, and then the kingdom's taken away, and then we have Darius who responds in a totally different fashion. That these stories are connected, and that they're showing two sides of how do you respond to the God of Israel.
The narrative technique is called twinning, when you have these two stories that kind of show both the similarities, but then also the differences between people's response. And that's what we have. I think that's exactly right. There's a contrast here between these two, the Belshazzar and Darius.
Yeah. So this is one thing that kind of as we were reading this, kind of stuck in my head, and maybe you can give some wisdom to this, is we've gone from calling Daniel Belteshazzar to Daniel.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Is this because of Nebuchadnezzar's change that he allowed Daniel to return back to this idea of his real name and not?
I don't want to make too much of that. I mean, it's possible. And of course you got to remember you have a whole different nation. You have a whole different people coming in at this point as well who would
even back in 5 it says like he did this because Daniel, whom the king called Belteshazzar, was found to have
Belteshazzar.
Yeah, so I didn't know, like, did they know him by both names, or what was going on there?
That would be my guess. So yeah, I would say officially, like when he went to work, I'm sure the king called him Belteshazzar, right? Now, I don't know about afterwards. It may
after
be.
hours. Daniel, man.
No, I'm saying more like when he's hanging out, when he's hanging out with
With the
those other
boys
guys,
back
right?
in the, yeah.
Azariah and all those guys. I think that they would have gone by that. And I'm gonna be honest here. There's two reasons I think that. One of them, well, I guess this is the main reason.
Don't get too controversial here.
I'm not. This is just my experience of living in a country where there were multiple cultures together. So, when I was in the Dominican Republic, you had not only the Spanish speaking culture there, but you also had the Haitian culture. And so there are a lot of people there who had 2, sometimes 3 names, and they would be used in the different context. So you get what I'm saying? So,
yeah.
And so a lot of people didn't understand that, that they just thought that was their name. So I had a guy that we knew that was, well, I guess I shouldn't use names, but had a Spanish name, and everybody just assumed that was his name. And even on Facebook, he had that name twice, and everybody just assumed, well, it's his first name and his last name. And it's like, no, his official name is a French or Creole name, and that's just what he goes by because no one can pronounce that in Spanish, right?
Yes.
But there are other reasons too. Not only that, but sometimes you're given a name that may have significance of some sort, and a nickname, right? There are times you go by a different kind of name. So I don't. Well, you do have some significant name changes, like Peter, for example. Here's where we always had to be careful.
And Saul and Paul he kind of had a significant name change, didn't he?
Was it? See, that's the one I was balk at, because I honestly think it was simply because he had the name Shaul, which was after he was a Benjamite, right? He was from the tribe of Benjamin, so he was from the tribe of Shaul, from Saul's tribe. But then Paulos is a Greek name.
So it's just because he was going to the Gentiles that changed to Paul?
And I'm going to go ahead and tell you that, and this, I have no way to prove this. I think he had the name before, because where he lived, I think he was just called Paul. And I think in Gentile context, he was called Paul. And I'd say when he was in a Jewish context, he was called Shaul. That'd be my guess. Saul. That would be my guess. And the reason I think that is,
this is a good aside to Daniel.
This is far aside to Daniel. So he was a Roman citizen,
right?
And where he lived was in Syria. And so he was a Jewish person living in kind of a Gentile context where, there's every indication that he had Greek education, indication that he had Greek education. Not only he quotes poets that were used, when people were learning Greek, he uses rhetorical forms that were clearly taught in class, in the classroom. Then, there are all kinds of indications that he had a Greek education, and his family had some kind of connection that had gotten them, even though they were Jews by ethnicity, had gotten them citizenship. And Paul makes it clear, I didn't gain this. I didn't pay for this. I was born a Roman citizen. So it wasn't him, it was his family.
Right.
Okay. And so, and I find it, well, anyway, that's enough speculation.
Rabbit trail.
But anyway, I just think he had the name Paulos. I don't know if Shaul's difficult for a Greek person to say. I don't know.
Okay.
But
let's return back to our story. I'm sorry.
That's fine.
No, but that was good. So there's something in the name. I just saw that we kind of went from this.
I do think there's significance.
There's
significance in Daniel and Belteshazzar. Yeah, and so I do. Yeah, it could be. It could be at least. And here's the thing: whether it's historical or not, it could be a narrative device. I don't know. We'd have to look at. Is he ever called Belteshazzar after that? And different. We'd have to make some different connections there. I think, but I don't know. Could be.
Excellent. All right, so. You have something in Hebrews you want me to read here?
Yeah, go ahead and read that, and then I was just going to ask in general, what do you think we've learned from these narratives, from this, as we conclude this narrative section?
All right, I'm going to read. This is Hebrews 11:32 through 34. And what more shall I say? I don't have time to tell about Gideon, Barak, Samson, and Jephthah, about David and Samuel and the prophets, who through faith conquered kingdoms, administered justice, and gained what was promised, who shut the mouths of lions, quenched the fury of the flames, and escaped the edge of the sword, whose weakness was turned to strength, and who became powerful in battle and routed foreign armies.
So, he's obviously summarizing. This is the end of that faith chapter, we call it, the
heroes of the faith.
Heroes of the faith. And so you've got all those stories early on, and now at the end, he kind of just summarizes. Here are these other, and I'm not even going to talk about these, but obviously Daniel is mentioned there, at least in the terms of the shutting of the mouths of the lions, right? That's a direct reference to that Daniel story. The whole idea of bringing kingdoms, I think had maybe something to do with Daniel, because here he was present at the day that God declared that I'm bringing the Babylonian Empire to an end. These people who've taken my people into captivity that God allowed, or even we could go so far as God caused to take them into captivity. Daniel is present. He is, so to speak. He's in the room, right? In the room where it happened.
Yep.
When this change took place.
Yeah. Great.
So yeah, I just thought that was an interesting little thing, the whole idea of the mouths of lions being shut. But do you want to talk about the Tremper Longman thing that you had? Yeah.
So there's chiasm, would you call it? Yeah.
Or chiasm.
I knew you said it some way I didn't say.
Chiasm, whatever. Yeah.
Satrap. Anyway, satrap, chiasm.
You say tomato.
I say tomato, satrap. Let's call the whole thing off. All right, so if you're still with us, so I was reading.
Thank you.
Thank you. So I was reading Tremper Longman, who's been a guest on our podcast,
on our show,
published a book, because I got Logos, by the way. So I've got all these books now. So
I was going to mention that. We'll talk about that some next week.
Yeah.
Maybe it'll make it real exciting.
So I was looking through this book, because I'm scholar, How to Read Daniel. And so I'm reading this book, and he's drawing the connections, as you've kind of rightly pointed out here, that there's these couplets, these pairs of stories that kind of are mirrored to each other. That in chapter 2 of Daniel, we have a dream of a statue representing 4 kingdoms.
Right.
And then, as we'll go into next week, we have in chapter 7 a vision of beasts representing 4 kingdoms.
Right.
We have these things together. And then chapter 3, a court conflict, which is the 3 friends in the fiery furnace. And then what we just read today, a court conflict, Daniel's in the lions.
A lot of similarities.
There's these parallel stories that
we
we kind of see that it's, and what I think is interesting, and then finally interpreting Nebuchadnezzar's dream in Daniel 4, where Nebuchadnezzar goes nuts and goes, but then finds God, and then we have interpreting the writing on the wall in Daniel 5, when they have the elements, and then the kingdom's turned over.
Where his son loses the kingdom then.
Yeah, but we see these kind of couplets of stories, and that they kind of form this pyramid of stories about what's happening inside Daniel. And I thought that was really interesting. I think it's, as you said, like, this is the thing that I'm always learning. You and I had this conversation. It's like, duh, hit me upside the head. But like how these stories are put together is very intentional.
Yep.
It's not your Uncle Benny. I think that's who you call. That's your fictitious person named Uncle Benny.
Whoever's uncle. Yeah.
Uncle Beanie. I'm going to call him, since we can't agree on words.
Beanie.
Uncle Beanie.
He always wore a beanie. And
oh, it's weird. Anyway, but this book is put together in a certain way that to draw your attention to the parallels of these stories. Again, we've seen that throughout the stories as well, like the God of the Babylonian God versus the Hebrew God. But even the larger narrative of the book has that structure as well, that we see these parallel stories taking place. And so that to me is always interesting. Like if you're reading the Bible, and I'm in a men's group, and I'm always pointing out, like, it's like, oh, we can jump here, like, why did they do this here? It's like, there's a reason. Like we can't, and I think that's the easy thing to miss, because sometimes we don't see the whole thing together.
They were meant to be read as a whole, and we don't. We in our modern, whatever group you're from, whatever kind of liturgical tradition you have, what we tend to do is we tend to read isolated passages. And even I think maybe it's just I'm used to this, but expositional preaching we've talked about, or that exegetical. There in the past, there were times I can remember a preacher, he'd have like one verse. This is my text for today, and then
Jesus wept.
Maybe even one word that he would pick up on, and what I'm saying, that and that's not the way that these texts were intended to be consumed, to be understood, I guess would be a better way to put it. Well, I guess Peterson's "eat this book" is not. But anyway, oh my gosh, the whole idea of understanding them and trying to when I talk about the intentionality, the important thing for me is that helps to show me what it is that I'm supposed to draw. What are the lessons? What is the meaning that I'm supposed to draw out of this? And I'm not trying to limit that, say there's one correct meaning, but I do think it gives us a good hint as to the directions that we need to be, the kind of things that we need to be learning from this. And that was my question. I think that's neat. You brought up this idea of chiasm. By the way, the Greek letter chi or chi is an X. It's like a capital X shape, and that's where they get that. The idea of, if you can imagine the farther X, the farther ends of the X kind of coming down toward the middle, and usually the point of a chiasm is the very central point is kind of what's really is going on here. And so this whole idea of interpreting the dream and the writing on the wall could be a part of this, understanding that God gives his people a better ability to understand the nature of reality than the king's advisors, right? Than the quote unquote wisest people in the land. May be kind of the primary point if we take the chiasm in that way. But anyway, my other question to you was kind of, as we as we draw this narrative section to a close, what do you think are some of the major lessons that we could take from this, or what are some of what you would call the major points?
I think the major point is about faithfulness in the face of blatant adversity.
Right.
That there is, I mean, it's obviously, Daniel knows, even this story we just read, that Daniel knows this decree has gone out, but it is not he's not changing his routine. Yeah. Now, he's not intentionally antagonistic.
Exactly.
Let's make that point out there, that we shouldn't be intentionally antagonistic of the culture.
He doesn't.
He's living in the culture, but he's not compromising to the culture.
Exactly.
Yeah. So
I think that's good.
Yeah, I think that's, and I just think the main thing in this is, like, I don't think Shadrach, Meshach, or those guys are kind of going, oh man, we're setting ourselves up to do this. It was just like, I'm going to be faithful in this, and God reveals himself in their faithfulness.
Yeah.
It's not like, we don't have a narrative of God saying, like, hey guys, this is going to happen, say this, and then I'm going to deliver you. It was, no, in their obedience, God is revealed. Not...
it's there. Isn't there that they say, even if
we don't, but it was just, that's the thing. Like, there was a risk to it. We talked about this, like, they acknowledge, like, maybe it won't, but still we will not compromise. And obedience gives the opportunity for God to reveal himself through some of this stuff. Not that God couldn't reveal himself otherwise.
No, I get what you're saying.
But in their individual, in their faithfulness, God is, they're exalted in that context, and it gives God an opportunity to reveal himself. And as you said, I think, it's one thing to go, if you're a captive there, and you can minister to your neighbor,
Right.
which is good.
Right.
But these are guys that are close to the king. Like this is you're changing the structure of what happens to your people by their faithfulness in the midst of adversity.
Which again, you meant, we'll pull Esther into that context as well. It's the same kind of, just for a time as this, that you've been brought into this position.
Yeah.
The other thing I want to call out is that it really struck me this time through, I think, is just the contrast between humility and egoism, right? The ruler who is putting themselves, exalting themselves, and Daniel, who's constantly pointing toward God. I think that to me really stuck out a lot this time around. Building a statue to yourself, that kind of thing, you know, and then being made into an animal. That sort of
gold statues to eating grass,
right? And the pride of Belshazzar and his feast. And I've often talked about that. Just this idea that we're impregnable.
You're surrounded.
We're invincible. And that very night, the kingdom is ripped away from him. So I think that kind of the foibles or the fallibility of human pride, I think is one of the things I noticed this time through. Yeah. Anything else you want to mention, or is that?
No, and I think it's great, again, as I always say this, to go through these narratives a little bit, look at structure, look at some of those things, that cultural things that are not plainly visible as an English reader sometimes, to see, we talked about the names from the very beginning, what the names represented, some of that historical context that we talked about in chapter 5 with the war that's, the siege that's being laid outside, with the Medes and Persians right outside. Again, that's not in scripture. Not to say that the scripture is deficient. It's telling the story it needs to tell, but that historical context gives us a richer idea of, again, that pride.
Which I think for the original readers would have been a part, they would have known that story.
It's yes. But apparently us, 3,500 years later, we've missed out on it. Yeah. Is it 3,500 years? No, that's 3,000. 3,000.
It would have been 606.
2,600. Yeah, David would have been 3,000. Anyway, so numbers. So coffee. But no, I think it's just good to go through there, look at the structure, see what's happening, and I'm really excited to get into Daniel 7. Yeah. Because I think this is if you're going to pick out the easy parts of Daniel to talk about, there's still plenty of good things in there. But to kind of get into the other pieces of this and what Daniel is pointing towards, what this prophetic vision is pointing towards.
Well, I think it'll give us a context too, because we've already seen a kingdom change, right? We saw.
You're right.
And it was none other than God himself, with who had the writing on the wall, that this is the way it's going to happen. And there's even these, I haven't talked about it probably enough, but there's these echoes of Jeremiah that we have at the beginning of Daniel, for example, and at various places. We have these echoes of Jeremiah, and Jeremiah said, this is how it's going to happen. The Babylonians are going to come take us away, but in 70 years, then it's going to be, the kingdom's going to be restored to us. So, that kind of idea of, we talked about God's sovereignty, I think, and just these kings, it's almost comical in some ways that these kings, and maybe I'll read Isaiah 10 some next week, but these kings have this idea that it's their might and their power and their wisdom that's causing these world events. And Daniel's perspective is to say, no, it's God. There's a God in heaven, and he's on his throne. So.
Yeah. Well, great. Exciting.
I'm tempted to get on my soapbox, and you said all about a narrative. I will say that's my soapbox on John, folks, is, two things. Is one, when we read him with a harmony, we want to tear the Gospel of John apart, because 3 of the Gospels follow a very similar narrative
pattern
arc, right? Mm-hmm. Pattern. And we want to fit John into that. And in order to do that, we have to cut it into pieces and basically disjoint it. And so I think that's one thing I'll mention. And the other thing is we fail to notice when I think John intentionally moves something, like the temple incident, for example. to the beginning of the Gospel of John, and we're like, oh, or maybe there were two, and it's like, no, I think we're failing to. I think we're misreading narrative. Anyway, that's my little soapbox.
What? Narrative is important. Structure is important.
Another day.
Yeah, how the stories are structured. We've talked about that with Jody Owens when we've had Jody Owens on here. Like even Old Testament and Daniel, how the story is told. Yeah, Judges,
Joshua,
Samuel, Kings, Chronicles.
All those narratives.
All those narratives are important. Well, Brian,
even Genesis.
Yes, it is important. There, huh? Don't. Yeah. Anyway, well, Brian, thank you so much.
Yeah.
Looking forward to Daniel 7. We hope you all have enjoyed. Fun. We had a little rants today, a little offshoots, but that's all good. If you're enjoying the podcast, you can join us. Join us on Patreon. And Patreon is a lovely platform where you can get some swag. You can subscribe. You can say, I'm going to spend $5, $10, $15 a month to help support our mission and what we're doing here. Help us pay for gas money, for hosting, for hosting this,
coffee,
time, too much coffee. Don't take this as, don't cut back if you're supporting us now. But just kind of help doing this. We hope you find this helpful. Yeah. We would like to expand some of the things that we offer here going into the future once our lives become,
if they ever do.
Yeah.
And I'll say this, share. It's always, we're still having people who are discovering the podcast. It's always encouraging when someone shares with us, and let us know if you've just discovered the podcast, if you find it useful, just drop us a line. It helps keep us going, even more than caffeine.
Yes, you can send us a message on Facebook, Instagram. You can send us our email. You can send us a message through the website, thebiblebistro.com. So, Brian, thanks so much. And I'm definitely looking forward to next week.
Yeah, see you next week, Ryan.
Mm-hmm. Bye-bye.
Bye.